Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. I'm Roland Green, Director of the Stanford Humanities Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the last event in our spring quarter as part of our Inside the Center series. As we said when we started this series nearly a year ago, its purpose is to call attention to some of the most provocative, groundbreaking, and unusual work that is happening under our roof. To go inside the center always means to find out what our fellows, the scholars who spend a year with us, are thinking. But everyone is welcome inside, not only fellows. Whoever you may be, a current or former fellow, a Stanford student or faculty member, or someone joining us from a distance, please feel free to visit us often. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that real-time captioning is available. Please click on the closed caption icon at the bottom where it says CC to start or stop viewing captioning. The up arrow adjacent to the CC icon allows you to show subtitles, view the full transcript, or adjust captions as needed. When I became director of the Stanford Humanities Center in 2019, it was on the eve of our 40th anniversary celebration. And it seemed to me the occasion to reinforce the center's purpose, to expand our programs, and to uphold our distinctive office on campus as the place that brings the freshest and the most exciting ideas to our community. Over the past year, we have launched 3 other speaker series. One highlights Stanford faculty research, another explores emerging paradigms in the broader humanities, and yet another features distinguished scholars whose research lends itself to social change. Now, with this particular series, Inside the Center, which was our first venture into online programming last summer, we discuss the work that is happening right here in our building and converse with our fellows about how distinctive intellectual work is being made in their disciplines and how they fit into it. Now, before I introduce our speaker, Frederic Clark, I'd like to mention that today's presentation is being recorded and will be available on our website in the coming days. And also, if you would like to submit a question to the speaker, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. You can do that anytime during the event, and we will do our best to get to your question following the lecture. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Frederic Clark, who is concluding a year with us as a Humanities Center Fellow. Today, he'll be discussing his recent book, The First Pagan Historian, The Fortunes of a Fraud from Antiquity to the Enlightenment, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. Professor Clark is Assistant Professor of Classics at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. He specializes in the afterlife of classical antiquity in medieval and early modern Europe. In addition to that book, The First Pagan Historian, he is co-editor of a book entitled Thinking in the Past Tense, 8 Conversations from University of Chicago Press in 2019. His articles have appeared in a variety of journals, such as the Journal of the History of Ideas, Past and Present, Journal of the Warburg and Courtauld Institutes, among others. He has spent his fellowship year with us this year at work on a book project titled Dividing Time, The Invention of Historical Periods in Early Modern Europe, which is under contract with the University of Chicago Press. Fred, I want to thank you for joining us today. And I know that a lot of this year's fellows are watching Fred today because he is popular among them for his engagement with everybody's work and for his openness to thinking out loud and thinking together, even in a time of social distancing, or perhaps I should say, especially in a time of social distancing. So Fred, it's been terrific having you as a fellow this year, and we're looking forward to hearing about your work.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Roland. Thank you for that very kind and generous introduction. And before I begin, I just want to extend a special thank you to you for bringing us all together here and for guiding us through this fellowship year. I'm so grateful to you and to everyone here at the Stanford Humanities Center for making our time here so rich and so meaningful, despite all the extraordinary challenges of this pandemic year. I've learned so much from all of you. And it has been not just a privilege, but it has also been such a joy. It has truly been great fun to be a part of this community this past year. And so before I begin, I just want to extend my thanks to all of the SHC staff, to my fellow fellows, and of course to everybody near and far today in the virtual audience. means a lot to me to have you here, since I know that one more Zoom in these days of Zoom fatigue is no light task. So I will do my very best, hopefully, to make this fun. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So in 2010, The Onion published this satirical article entitled "Historians Admit to Inventing Ancient Greeks." The piece detailed the startling admission by a group of eminent scholars that they had fabricated what we think of as ancient Greek culture, from Homer to Aristotle to Euclidean geometry. According to the report, quote, "The group acknowledged that the idea of a sophisticated, flourishing society existing in Greece more than 2 millennia ago was a complete fiction created by a team of some 24 historians, anthropologists, and classicists who worked nonstop between 1971 and 1974 to forge Greek documents and artifacts." And an accompanying photograph of a Greek vase in this article even bore the humorous caption, quote, "Just one of many ancient artifacts dreamt up in a basement in Somerville, Massachusetts." Now, we can enjoy a good laugh from this piece, but the Onion's satirical claim to have exposed the large-scale forging of antiquity was hardly without precedent. In the years around 1700, when new forms of historical skepticism were very much in vogue, the French Jesuit scholar Jean Ardouin announced a startling discovery with dire seriousness. Almost the entire extant corpus of ancient Greco-Roman texts were forgeries, with the lucky exceptions of Cicero, Horace, Pliny's Natural History, Virgil's Georgics, and Homer. And just as The Onion attributed its plot to scholars at the Smithsonian and elsewhere, so Ardouin blamed the faking of antiquity upon a cabal of medieval Benedictine monks led by one Severus Arctonius. Now, in his Prolegomena to the censure of ancient writers, he hypothesized in clinical, and we might say paranoid detail, about how this forging could have been accomplished. And I quote, "If I had a genius equal to any of those ancients, and if a desire came into my mind to print something under the feigned name of any writer out of those whose works are believed to have perished, if I were to write it on parchment, which in the course of a few years would appear some 600 or 800 years old, using the right ink for the job, if I were to transfer into that work certain excerpts from ancient writings, which are commonly supposed to be genuine, with a view to induce faith in my work and belief in its antiquity, tell me, would it not be right for anyone to try and find out and detect any hidden fraud or impiety that he might suspect?" So for the Jesuit scholar, philological criticism easily became a form of hypercriticism. However, both Ardouin's claim and its present-day successor in The Onion reveal a fundamental anxiety about the thing that we call antiquity. Whether expressed via seriousness or satire, it is a fear that whatever ancient past we choose to invest with cultural capital, with exemplarity, with canonicity, is in some sense an invention. Perhaps an invention in an ideological sense, as when we speak of something like, quote, the invention of tradition, or even an invention in a more literal sense, when we speak of forgery or falsification. So, although few went as far as Ardouin and claimed that something like Virgil's Aeneid was actually the work of devious 14th century monks, many of his contemporaries knew that sometimes ancient texts were hardly as old and as venerable as they claimed to be. And some of these texts simply refused to disappear, despite the best efforts of critics to debunk them. So my book, which I'll be talking about today, is the story of one such text, which, as we will see, was still read in the decades around 1700. And so in what follows, I will offer a brief summary of the book and the place of its protagonist, who claimed to be nothing less than the first pagan to write history, in these long-standing discourses of forgery and antiquity alike. So our story begins with the scholar Isadore Seville, seen here. Depending on how we periodize, Isadore was either one of the last scholars of antiquity or one of the first and most influential scholars of the Middle Ages. He served as Archbishop of Seville, and he died in 636. He is best known for his etymologies, a massive collection of erudition on almost every imaginable topic. And for this reason, in fact, some even today refer to him under the somewhat dubious title of the patron saint of the internet, with the idea that this sort of medieval encyclopedia is sort of the first database. Now, in his etymologies, Isidore defined the various disciplines or branches of learning. And when he got to history, he explained that it required direct eyewitness observation. He insisted, among the ancients, no one wrote history unless they had been present and seen those things to be described. Things that are seen are presented without lying. So, repeating terms with deep roots in the ancient Latin exegetical tradition, the encyclopedist went on to distinguish history from other types of narrative. A history, or Latin a historia, recorded what happened, whereas a fable or a fabula was an unrealistic account that was manifestly contrary to nature or contra naturam. Only history, therefore, vouchsafed by the eyewitness, could record what had happened without lying. Now, after defining history, Isidore explained who first practiced it. He affirmed, quote, "Among us, Moses first composed a history on the beginning of the world." So the first sacred history was fittingly an account of Genesis, the origins of the world itself. Yet Isidore's pagan first will strike us as more unusual. Among the pagans, or apud gentiles, Dares Phrygius first brought forth a history concerning Greeks and Trojans, which they say was written by him on leaves of palm. Hence, just as Moses was the first sacred historian, so Dares was the first pagan historian. And it was only after Dares that Isidore listed ancient historians who might be more familiar to us, such as Herodotus. And so this title, First Pagan Historian, would define Dares' fortunes for the following millennium. So who was this Dares? He was the purported author of a strange little book, usually titled De Excidio Troiae Historia, or the history concerning the destruction of Troy. And these are images from a wonderful 1513 edition, which has these great depictions of Greeks and Trojans in sort of fittingly anachronistic knightly attire. So we have, for instance, let's see, where is it? Yeah, so we have, for instance, a very dour-looking Menelaus, and here are some others. So Dares claimed to have been an eyewitness observer of the ancient conflict between Greeks and Trojans that is now known as the Trojan War. And as a result, he claimed to have seen Odysseus, Aeneas, Priam, Agamemnon, and other heroes in the flesh. Hence, to use Isidore's formulation, he could report on them without lying. He proclaimed that Aeneas was not only eloquent, pious, and charming, but also ruddy in appearance, with lively and dark eyes. Nestor was not only a prudent counselor, but he also possessed a long hooked nose. And he included eye-popping details, including the rather outlandish figure that over the 10 years, 6 months, and 12 days of the war, some 886,000 Greeks and 676,000 Trojans perished. And Dares wrote up the war in dry, bare-bones, quasi-journalistic prose. He promised to deliver the facts in just the facts, stripped of mythological phenomena. And as a result, one could say that the world that he conjured was a disenchanted one, devoid of any intervention from deities or other supernatural phenomenon. And just to give you a sense of how this worked in practice, this is a depiction of the Judgment of Paris in that same edition. When Dares details the Judgment of Paris, in which Paris chooses Aphrodite over the goddesses Athena and Hera, rather than giving a direct narration of this event, which would involve supernatural phenomena, he merely reports it as something that Paris tells his fellow Trojans happened to him in a dream in the course of an assembly. So in other words, we don't get any direct reporting of anything involving gods or goddesses. Rather, it's all indirect. Now, you might be wondering, how did the war diary of a purported Trojan eyewitness end up extant in Latin? Well, this incongruity possessed a convenient explanation. Dares' history began with a prefatory epistle written by its supposed translator, the Roman biographer and historian Cornelius Nepos, an associate of such famous Romans as Cicero and the poet Catullus, and addressed to none other than the Roman historian Sallust. So Nepos wrote to Sallust with some exciting news. He had been busily engaged in study at Athens, which might seem plausible enough, and there he had happened upon Dares' hitherto lost book. Here was a tangible relic of a distant past already considered ancient in the 1st century BCE. For the book that he supposedly discovered was an autographed manuscript written in the hand of Dares himself. And I should add that this kind of trope of the feigning of the sort of fake discovery of a lost book is actually a very common one in forgeries of this sort. So Nepos then explained to Sallust that he had translated this book literally, or to the word, into Latin. And the Latin that resulted conveyed the feel of a soldier's war diary. It favored simple, repetitious syntax, along with a rather limited vocabulary. And in many ways, it is, as a result, perhaps not the most, to put it mildly, not the most exciting of reads. But vouching for Dares' superior authenticity as an eyewitness, Nepos then declared that because Dares had, quote, lived and fought at that time when Greeks fought Trojans, that he was far superior to Homer, quote, who was born many years after the war had been waged. So in other words, Dares is better than Homer because he was there. But still more strangely, Nepos then added that a trial had been held at Athens in which Homer was judged insane for depicting humans at war with gods. Dares, in contrast, had not engaged in such frivolous mendacity. Now, nor was Homer the only ancient poet whose narrative of Troy Dares contradicted. Virgil had famously depicted the Trojan Aeneas, seen here in a Renaissance painting, as a pious hero who escaped the burning city to establish a colony of Trojan exiles in Italy that would one day grow into the Roman Empire. In sharp contrast, Dares made Rome's future founder an impious traitor, responsible for the very destruction of the city. So as a result, the Trojan horse is entirely absent from Dares' tale. Instead, Aeneas, along with several other co-conspirators, cuts a deal with the Greek leader Agamemnon to end the war. And then, under the cover of night, they open the city's gates to Agamemnon's troops. And in an appropriately rationalizing detail, Aeneas lets the Greeks in, as Dares reports, through a gate that boasts the sculpted wooden head of a horse. So we almost seem in this little vignette to catch Dares winking. And in return, the Greeks grant Aeneas safe passage to leave Troy upon his fall. And in the final lines, we learn that Aeneas departs the city with 3,400 followers and 22 ships. But tellingly, we are not told where he goes. So as a quick aside, because it'll become important later, I should add that Dares was often read alongside another supposedly ancient account of the Trojan War, this one purportedly written from the Greek side, by one Dictus of Crete, or Dictus Cretensis. And here's a Amsterdam printing of the two of them together. Now, Dictus, he purports to be a Greek soldier. His history also contains a forged prefatory, frame. And this makes Dares look rather dull in comparison, because in Dictus's preface, there is an earthquake on the island of Crete during the reign of Nero. The ground shakes, and voila, Dictus's book emerges from his tomb. Some shepherds are walking by. They notice this book, and somehow the shepherds send it on to the governor of the island, who then sends it on to Nero. So that is just to give you a sort of taste of some of these really fantastical finding narratives in these books. So we still don't know who actually wrote Dares' destruction of Troy, or where or when they wrote it. But scholars are now generally agreed that it is a late antique fabrication, likely composed in the 5th or 6th century CE. And some have speculated that the text's underlying claim to be a translation may contain a kernel of truth, and that perhaps the destruction of Troy was based in some fashion upon a lost Greek original from the period that we now refer to as the Second Sophistic. Now, this theory raises a related question of whether the original text, if it did exist, was perhaps ironic or parodic, somewhat ludic in its intentions. So perhaps in some sense, it was not unlike a kind of learned onion article for those who were sort of in the know, as many Second Sophistic authors were, about anti-Homeric critique. And I should just add, there have Greek papyrus fragments of Dictus have been discovered, but to date, nothing of Dares. So whatever its original intent, and that's a vexed question under normal circumstances, it will suffice to note that Dares was, however, taken earnestly for over a millennium. So thanks in part to Isadore's endorsement of the First Pagan Historian, the destruction of Troy proved to be a medieval bestseller. It survives today in approximately 200 manuscripts produced between the 8th century and the 15th. And in addition, it inspired numerous versifications, translations, and expansions from medieval Latin verse and Old French all the way to Icelandic. But why did Dares occupy for so long such a prominent place in a sea of forgeries? The answer is that the destruction of Troy was not just any forged ancient history. Instead, for much of its afterlife, it was considered one of the first and oldest works of history ever to be written. And so, as I argue in my study, Dares' unlikely survival for over a millennium reflects a paradox that has long defined retrospective visions of antiquity. And this seeming cognitive dissonance still shapes our own apprehensions of the distant past, whether or not we choose to label that past ancient. So this was a problem that was present already in the ancient Greco-Roman world. So for instance, the historian Livy acknowledges that much of early Roman history is more fable than uncorrupted fact. And Varro and other ancient chronologers even divide time according to what they call mythic and historical phases. These debates continue throughout the Middle Ages and early modernity, and they survive in disputes over historical truth and method from the Enlightenment onwards. And we can even see them reflected in Ardoin's conspiracy theorizing. So the crux of it is this. On the one hand, the more ancient something is, the more authoritative it was, and hence the truer it was. Yet conversely, something ancient, by virtue of its very status as antiquity, often seemed incapable of yielding certain truth, especially as it grew ever more distant from the present. So perhaps deep antiquity could only express itself through myth or fable. And any text that proclaimed itself a history from so remote a world ipso facto betrayed its status as a fake. So antiquity was simultaneously a criterion for affirming and for suspecting a text's veracity. So what accounted for the medieval popularity of the First Pagan Historian? Subversion was certainly a great part of it. Following the lead of the Romans, many medieval peoples likewise constructed elaborate genealogies that documented their supposed descent from the Trojans. Yet in doing so, they often asserted that they, and not Rome, were the best heirs to ancient Trojan Empire. So claims of Trojan descent allowed for both consanguinity and rivalry with the Roman past. And Dares proved the perfect text for this delicate dance. He supplied convenient corroboration of Roman original sin, so Aeneas's treachery, and a credible account of those events that precipitated the supposed migration of Trojan exiles after the war. So in many medieval manuscripts, the destruction of Troy served as a kind of prologue to tales of Trojan origins. It appeared in manuscripts of everything from the Frederick Chronicle, which claimed Frankish descent from an eponymous invented Trojan named Francio, which is one of my favorite false etymologies, to Geoffrey of Monmouth's spurious History of the Kings of Britain, which asserted that Britain was founded by the Trojan Brutus, and that London, or what became London, was actually Troia Nova, or New Troy, on the banks of the River Thames. So Rome was no longer the ultimate or the most consequential of new Troys. And so this is just to give you a sense of how these patterns worked in practice at the level of manuscripts. This is what is likely the oldest extant copy of the destruction of Troy, probably copied in the late 8th century at the Carolingian monastery of Lorsch. And in it, Dares appears directly before a text that is titled The Book of the History of the Franks. And this is another text that claims Frankish Trojan ancestry. And note the parallel. I've sort of highlighted the key parts here in yellow. Note the parallel between Gesta Troianorum, or the deeds of the Trojans. So this is how the scribe ends the text of Dares, and Gesta Francorum, the deeds of the Franks. This is how, on the very next line, the account of the Franks begins. Now, also note here, going back to the beginning, the small but very significant corruption in the name of Cornelius Nepos, the supposed translator. The scribe here does not say that it was translated into Latin a Cornelio Nepote, or by Cornelius Nepos, but rather confusedly and very corruptly renders it as a Cornelione Poete. So Nepos seems to have become a poet. And while I don't have time to address it in this particular talk, a large section of the book traces the many misadventures that result from errors of this sort. So for many centuries, Cornelius Nepos was actually taken mistakenly to have been an ancient Latin epic poet. And happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. Here's another good example of confusion. Here's a scribe who confuses the name Cornelius with another famous Cornelius from the annals of Roman historiography, and imagines that this is actually the translation of not Cornelius Nepos, but rather Cornelius Tacitus. And this is one of the most beautiful manuscripts of Dares. This is now in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. This was copied by hand. It's an autographed manuscript by the 12th century English historian William of Malmesbury. And he begins Dares with what I can only describe as sort of the best of all publishers' blurbs, which is the quote from Isadore Seville, namely, among the pagans, Dares Phrygius first composed a history concerning Greeks and Trojans. Now, I should also add that Dares affected medieval readings of Virgil. So, for instance, when a 12th century Virgil commentator, who's known as Pseudo-Bernardus Sylvestus, when he used the Aeneid and constructed this sort of very elaborate allegorical reading of it, he made sure to point out at the beginning that Virgil was not literally true and Dares was. And I quote, he says that Virgil does not follow the truth of history, the Historiae Veritatem, which Dares Phrygius describes, but rather he exalted the deeds in the flight of Aeneas through fictions, figmentis, in order to gain the favor of Augustus. So right, there's this recognition of the Aeneid as a sort of propagandistic work, and Dares as nothing but the truth. And in fact, when medieval poets start producing versions of Dares, some of which are in very elaborate Latin hexameters, they have to proclaim, despite the supposed mendacity of the poetic medium, that their poems are historically true. And so the most extreme example of this, which I talk about a bit in the book, is a poet who goes so far as to declare in verse that, quote, since I invent nothing, I must not be called a poet. And so all of these examples, I think, just illustrate the extent to which in the Middle Ages, Dares becomes kind of historical truth par excellence. Now, unfortunately, this was not to last for long. With the advent of the early Renaissance, the first cracks began to form in the Phrygians' reputation. In the year 1400, the Florentine chancellor and humanist Coluccio Salutati debated whether Aeneas was actually a traitor who had betrayed Troy to the Greeks. He acknowledged that this betrayal was alleged by, quote, the most ancient of historians who wrote Trojan history, Dares Phrygius and Dictus Cretensis, And so this is Dictus, the Greek forger that I mentioned. And more Dares and Dictus come to be evaluated sort of in a pair. Now, Salutati then notes, however, that other historians told a very different story. He notes, for instance, that Livy does not allege this. And so hence he says that one can either go with Dares and Dictus and call Aeneas a traitor, or one can defend Aeneas and hence dismiss Dares and Dictus as fabricators. And so with these words, Salutati became the first, or at least the first that we know of, to suggest that Dares might belong, as he put it, quote, among the Apocrypha. Now, despite Salutati's doubts, it was not until the 16th century that critics began to denounce Dares more forcefully. In 1531, the Spanish scholar Juan Luis Vives, a disciple of the humanist Erasmus, declared both Dares and Dictus, quote, figments of those who desired to play, or perhaps sort of engage in some kind of trickery with that most famous war. Yet neither Salutati nor Vives explained why they suspected Dares of falsehood. Like many critics, they inverted the maxim that teachers of composition often impart to their students. They told, but did not show. And one of the first to attempt that salutary task was this figure, the Portuguese humanist Gaspar Barros, who in 1565 penned this scathing attack against a modern forger, the Dominican friar Aeneas of Viterbo. And Aeneas is actually another very bizarre character who appears in chapter 4 of my book. One of the many strange characters that Dares seems to attract by almost magnetic force. Now, in this treatise, Barros enumerated a long list of fakes, and he cited Dares and Dictus as ancient precedents. He explained that the actual author of these Trojan histories had fabricated falsehood. And how did he know? Because the very ruse that the forger had used to imbue the work with ancient authority, namely the Roman author Cornelius Nepos and Sallust, had given him away. Barros mockingly marveled at how the forger had made, quote, the most noble historian Cornelius Nepos send this book to Sallust. And he expressed biting wonder at, quote, what sort of writer this Cornelius is, and how different from that Nepos, the most celebrated writer of Roman histories. And with poetic justice, Barros took down the anti-Virgilian Dares through a clever allusion to Virgil. He distinguished between the real and the fake Nepos with the words that Virgil had used to describe the apparition of the shade of Hector in Book 2 of the Aeneid. And so in the Latin, he changed Virgil's quantum mutatis ab illo Hectore into quantum mutatis ab illo Nepote. So, how changed from that Nepos. Like the living Hector and his ghost, the real Nepos and his forged counterpart were very different indeed. Now, by the early decades of the 17th century, more critics had turned against Dares. One of his most biting detractors was this figure, the Dutch classical scholar G.J. Vossius. And in his 1624 on the Greek De Historicis Graecis, on the Greek historians, he made an argument very much akin to Barros. Dares' deficient Latinity proved him false. For he observed, what could be purer or more elegant than the surviving works of the real Cornelius Nepos? And what was the translation of Dares compared to them? And then, comparing the two, he echoed a fitting line from the Roman playwright Plautus, exclaiming, and I quote, puppies smell one way, pigs another. So just as Barros had used a clever adaptation of Virgil to indict Dares, so Vossius invoked Plautus, once more deriding fakes through the satirical deployment of classical allusion. So this is where and how we might expect stories of this nature to end. Falsehood is exposed, criticism triumphs, and we can all go home satisfied. But what motivated such invective? So in other words, in the 1620s, well over 2 centuries after Salutati, Vossius still had to point out that Dares was not who he said he was. Why? Perhaps because the protests of such critics did not significantly dent Dares' popularity. And that popularity was predicated upon continued affirmations of his authenticity, of his status, in fact, as nothing less than the first pagan to write history. In the more than 200 years that separated Salutatis Florence and Vossius's Amsterdam, Dares kept on being read. There were some 30 or so printings of the text between 1472 and 1600. And this is just to give you an example of some of them. At the same time, Dares was translated, as you can see here, into German, Italian, French, and English. And here are pages from the French and the Italian editions. So to many of his editors and printers, he remained as much an exemplary historian as he had been to Isadore of Seville. Meanwhile, Renaissance encyclopedists kept on affirming his veracity. And nothing proved more attractive to them than something from antiquity that could count as a first. Here is a life of Dares taken from the Italian encyclopedist Raffaello Volterrano. It records that quote, the historian Dares Phrygius wrote in Greek of the Trojan War in which he himself fought. And as Isidore declared, he was nearly the first. He was nearly the first of the historians. Here, we find Dares in a revised edition of the Universal Library of the Swiss polymath Conrad Gessner. And this entry merely copies Volterrano, but it adds that Dares flourished some 2,840 years after the creation of the world and some 1,120 years before Christ. We even get it in the French jurist Jean Baudin's Method for the Easy Comprehension of Histories. At the very back of this book, as kind of an appendix, he arrays the historians of different peoples in supposedly chronological order. And as you can see here, this is his list of historians of the Greeks. And it does not begin with such usual suspects that we might suspect, as Herodotus or Thucydides. They appear a bit lower. Rather, it begins with Dares and Dictus, who he dates to 1129 years before the birth of Christ. Now, but were these advertisements merely formulaic, or did some still earnestly accept Dares's claims? Here, book history and the notes that readers inserted in their books can offer us some insights. One of the most enthusiastic early modern readers of the First Pagan Historian was the Elizabethan scholar and occultist John Dee. Dee owned a combined 1573 printing of Dares and Dictus. And when he annotated it, he noted, as you can see here, quote, the certain truth of this history, veritas huius historiae certa, where Dictus proclaimed his status as an eyewitness. When he got to Dares, he wrote repeated variations of proditio, or treason or treachery, several times throughout his copy. And when Dares explained how the traitors let the Greeks slip into Troy, he exclaimed what is perhaps my all-time favorite marginal note, seen here, nihil hic de equo Troiano, or nothing here concerning the Trojan horse. So for Dee and many others, Dares and Dictus remained true history. And I should add that another of Dee's fellow Elizabethans agreed. In his Defense of Poetry, published posthumously in 1595, the Elizabethan poet and courtier Philip Sidney launched a systematic apology for poetic fiction. He argued that simple literal truth alone could not edify readers in the way that poetic inventions could. And when making this argument, he invoked Dares, albeit in a negative sense. For he declared that the, quote, feigned Aeneas in Virgil was more morally useful than, quote, the right Aeneas in Dares Phrygius. In other words, a reader could learn more from a pious hero than a feckless traitor. The poetical work of Virgil, despite its literal mendacity, was, in Sidney's words, more doctrinable, right, more teachable than Dares's history. And so Sidney asserted Dares' historicity when critiquing history as an impoverished discourse. So if that's the late 16th century, by the middle of the 17th century, there are some for whom Dares remains true and historical. No one devoted more attention to Trojan equine matters than this figure, Fortunio Licheti, a professor and physician at the University of Padua, who also corresponded with Galileo. And amongst his publications is a 1653 emblem book in which he seeks to discern the sort of meanings behind various ancient images. And this is actually the image that I used. This image of the horse is what I used for the cover photo of the book. And in this passage, Licheti says, above all, we must determine whether the story of the Trojan horse is a history or a fable. So we can see him sort of still using those categories of historia and fabula to debate sort of the relative truth of someone like Virgil versus someone like Dares. And as a result, he dismisses Virgil's historical truth, and instead he chooses Dares because, in his words, he offers a, quote, simple narrative containing naked and true history. So as late as 1653, we still see that this kind of simplicity equals veracity. So in the last section of my talk, I'm going to briefly move into the period that we refer to as the Enlightenment. So Dares did not have as many defenders in the 18th century, but his destruction of Troy was still read. In fact, he and Dictus would play a cameo role in one of the most original 18th century rethinkings of the relationship between history and myth. 1725, the Neapolitan philosopher Giambattista Vico published the first edition of his Scienza Nuova, or New Science. And here, Vico added a new twist to that long-standing debate between historia and fabula, history and fable. He argued that a kind of natural poetry was the oldest form of human expression. Poetry was far anterior to philosophy, history, or theology. And it was, quote, the common error of in verse. So in Vico's system, poets did not speak as historians did, but very importantly, they spoke before historians spoke. And so in the second edition of his New Science, published in 1730, he included this passage, in which he added that the Trojan War, as it is recounted by Homer, is thought by circumspect critics never to have taken place, right? Because poets do not speak in a matter that would be literally true. But then he also added, quote, authors like Dictus Cretensis and Dares Phrygius, who gave prose accounts of it as historians of their time, are by these same critics relegated to the library of imposture. So in other words, the first pagan historian could not have flourished at a time when the pagans had yet to invent history. So as my final example, at some point in the 18th century, Dares made his way across the Atlantic. Thomas Jefferson acquired a copy of the text, but his surviving correspondence suggests that he did not think highly of the Phrygian. The future president corresponded at length with the English chemist and religious freethinker Joseph Priestley. And in his letters to Priestley, Jefferson wrote extensively about his plans for what would become the University of Virginia. In January 1800, he fired off a list of proposed subjects for this curriculum. It would include botany, chemistry, zoology, anatomy, surgery, geography, commerce, etc. Yet, just a few days later, on January 27th, Jefferson wrote to Priestley again with an apology. He had omitted the study of ancient languages. And then this is what he writes, quote, I think the Greeks and Romans have left us in the present models which exist of fine composition, whether we examine them as works of reason or of style and fancy. To read the Latin and Greek authors in their original is a sublime luxury, and I deem luxury in science to be at least as justifiable as in architecture, painting, gardening, or the other arts. I enjoy Homer in his own language, infinitely beyond Pope's translation of him, and both beyond the dull narrative of the same events by Dares Phrygius. And it is an innocent enjoyment. So for Jefferson, the most noteworthy thing about Dares was not that he was a fake, but rather that he was dull. And perhaps Jefferson, who rationalized his personal copy of the Gospels, excising miraculous and metaphysical content from the story of Jesus, just as Dares had claimed to rationalize mythological content from the Iliad, perhaps he took Troy's fabulous nature as a given. Or perhaps he would have fallen for Dares had he seemed less dull. For several decades earlier, Jefferson had actually fallen hook, line, and sinker for one of his era's most notorious forgeries. He had enthusiastically accepted the forged poetry of Ossian, the so-called Scottish Homer, who was actually invented by one James Macpherson. And he even declared in a letter to one of Macpherson's relatives that he considered, quote, this rude bard of the North to be nothing less than the greatest poet that had ever existed. So for Jefferson, Dares was not to be faulted for faking history, but rather for failing at the proper requirements of literature. He could not provide the sublime luxury or innocent enjoyment of a belletristic sort that Jefferson claimed to locate not only in ancient poetry, but also in architecture and painting, or even gardening. For Jefferson, Dares was a barrier to his proper enjoyment of Antiquity's Prince of Poets, much as Alexander Pope's English translation was. And while perhaps this judgment was uncharitable, it set the stage for things to come. So in the 19th and the 20th centuries, whether because he was false or because he was dull, Dares slipped into obscurity. He seems to have failed as both a history and fable, a historia and a fabula. His critics maintained that he did not possess the requisite veracity for the former or the requisite art for the latter. But we can now see how the critics who rejected his status as history also did so by creating the very categories that enabled their subsequent rejection of his status as literature. In other words, the philological comparisons that severed Dares from Latin's supposed golden age, so if we think of Vossius saying puppies versus pigs, this did not just unmask him as unhistorical, it also rendered him unaesthetic. Yet even if we accept the former proposition, we should not blindly accept the latter. After all, we might today think very differently from Jefferson and his aesthetics. Whether or not we find beauty or even pleasure in Dares' formulaic character portraits and minimalist prose, we need not reflexively dismiss him as dull, i.e., as somehow below the requirements of art and literature. Even if readers of the last 2 centuries have not found the book congenial to their tastes, the destruction of Troy managed to inspire for over a millennium before that. So what of forgery and criticism in all of this? The history of forgery, including Dares, reveals that criticism, that art of interpretation often hailed as one of the highest achievements of human rationality, has never strayed far from error. The human faculties that stimulated the criticism of antiquity not only stimulated the production of forgeries as well, but they also sustained them, and hence false visions of that same antiquity long after such forgeries were first fabricated. Put another way, the phenomena that we associate with the triumph of a certain kind of rational criticism, so empiricism, historicism, eyewitness observation, disenchantment, these can just as easily serve as agents of falsification or invention. And moreover, when applied to something called antiquity, these tools are often stretched to their limits, even as the stakes rise exponentially. We need them to give us something like the First Pagan Historian, a true first. Yet the very intensity of this need ipso facto threatens their efficacy. The distant past is simultaneously too far from our perception and too close to our desires. So no one quite knew how the ancient Greco-Roman world had understood as pivotal yet amorphous a concept as historical truth. But they could not help but define their own take on that concept via that world's ostensibly oldest historian. And we can express the terms of this debate in many oppositions: fact versus fiction, allegory and the figurative versus the literal, or even history versus literature. But whatever specific terminology they adopted, readers of Dares were thinking through this same dichotomy. In effect, they all asked variations on the same fundamental question. Did Antiquity, that most distant yet most exemplary and canonical of pasts, become adulterated as soon as it became historical? History, whether in Antiquity, the Middle Ages, early modernity, or today, has always had its critics, like Philip Sidney, who have dismissed it as a comparatively impoverished discourse. And perhaps that's what makes Forgery so compelling. It is a temptingly easy shortcut, a way of transcending history's necessary and often messy limitations. So the longevity of Dares' afterlife is central to understanding equally long-standing debates over both the contested history of antiquity and the contested antiquity of history. Indeed, precisely because the first pagan historian embodied the authority of history and antiquity alike, he was alternately challenged and embraced by over a millennium of interpreters who were eager to define, revise, and sometimes even refute the relationship between the two. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred. And I know we're going to get a lot of questions from our audience. I'm glancing over at the community that you've assembled for this talk today. It is a little under 100 people right now, and it looks to me like we have people from every continent except Antarctica. So what I want to urge on our viewers is, if you have a question for Fred Clark, please put it in the Q&A, and we will pass it along as best we can. I want to start with a question about it's a question about the mood behind the phenomenon you're describing. And I would put it this way. 40 years ago, a great scholar of Renaissance literature, Thomas M. Green, published a book called The Light in Troy, in which he coined a term, humanist pathos, by which he meant this intense feeling that thinkers in the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance had toward antiquity, this feeling that they wanted more than anything to merge into it and to be part of it and to be in conversation with it. And at the same time, they knew that there was an unbridgeable gulf between them and antiquity, that they would never be part of it, and that they were doomed to live in a time that they thought of as debased, something that could never be, it's like, like they said in Elizabethan England, all the great heroic people have died and there are no more great people anymore, and it seems to me that what you're describing is a chapter in a story of a kind of humanist pathos, in which Dares, whoever he was, is clearly someone who is burning with a desire to write something that could be absorbed into the classical canon. Yeah. And at the same time, the people that are critiquing him and responding to him later, such as Salutati or Vives, they're angry, and they have this this kind of intense affect around the idea that this thing, and the people who accept him probably also have this intense affect about wanting to believe in him. And so everybody on all sides seems to be endowed with this kind of intense feeling around this. And so my first question, just really a really general question, just how would you explain to a modern reader why did they care so much?
Yeah.
What is the strength? What is the origin of the strength of these feelings on all sides?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you. That's a wonderful, it's a beautiful question, and I think that it captures so vividly, right? This feeling of this intense affective bond that these readers have towards what they imagine as the ancient, and I think as I think you capture so well there, that kind of what we might describe as sort of this kind of emotive investment, that it equally animates both the critics and the true believers, and I think that is one of the things that I think is perhaps most sometimes I think most shocking or most disorienting to a modern in the sense of a 20th or 21st century reader who sometimes encounters these debates, is that we, I think, sometimes have a tendency to imagine that the critics, the debunkers, come in with a kind of dispassionate air, that they say, we have to, we need to stop investing ourselves so much in antiquity, and we need to begin to sort of refine these tools of a kind of disinterested, almost impersonal philology to capture, things as they truly were, sort of the supposed sort of dream of historicism. And I think, as you say, what happens when we actually look at some of these sources, whether it's Vives or Salutati or Vossius, that if anything, they are doing this because they have just as great a desire to get back to that true antiquity.
Right.
It makes them all the more sort of angry that there are these fakers like Dares who are getting in the way, and that the anger that, for instance, someone like Vossius has, that that this writer could almost fool people into thinking that his Latin was the same as Cornelius Nepos. That irks him to no end. And so I think that there are sort of two competing, we see in this discourse, right, two combinations of, to put in our terminology, historical and profoundly ahistorical ways of thinking about the past that are present in both the critics and the true believers. So one thing I hope is that this book will help to break down that dichotomy and to actually see that both sides, as it were, are coming from this. They're coming from a recognition of on the one hand, this intense longing for antiquity, and this awareness that antiquity is lost.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of the ultimate, right? What Green describes, right? That's the
right. Right. Because I often say to my students when I'm trying to explain how, in the early modern period, how they think about antiquity, I often say, let me sort of try this out on you, that a lot of these thinkers, like the ones you talk about, what they really want above all is a kind of direct sight line to antiquity. And when somebody gets in between them, and sort of, or cuts in line, as you're sort of saying that some of these people think that Dares is doing, somebody is interrupting that direct contact that they want to have. Of course, it's always indirect, and they know that, but the most direct possible contact that they could have with antiquity, when somebody interrupts it, when somebody breaks the circuit, then these powerful feelings of what you're describing of resentment come out. And then, but then when the period change, when the feeling dissipates over time, when people stop caring that much about having that kind of relationship to antiquity, then it stops mattering whether somebody like Dares is a forgery or not. The passion is gone from it, rather than, and it just becomes a kind of abstract question, something like that, which I think is what you're talking about toward the end of the talk in the chronological sequence that you're giving us. So let me ask you this. I want to now ask you something that invites you to kind of draw a line between this book and the project that you've been working on during the year at the Humanities Center, which, if the audience remembers from when I introduced you, I said is a new book called Dividing Time: The Invention of Historical Periods in Early Modern Europe. So what I want to ask you is, how does Dares and the story of forgery and its undoing, or its lack of undoing, how does that complicate these kind of macro narratives that divide history into periods.
Yeah. So I think in many ways I have been sort of working on, before I just finished this book, I was sort of working on these two projects concurrently, and sort of it's really interesting. Many of the same scholars sort of pop up in both of them, and one of the things I think that really actually got me interested in this question of, how did basically these humanist scholars come to give us our very problematic, our very oversimplified, but yet seemingly impossible to do away with sort of tripartite division of time into the ancient, the medieval, and the modern. And particularly in articulating that, how did they then come to define this kind of middle time? And one of the things, the ways that I think the story of Dares speaks to that is that it complicates both of those two divides. So one, the divide between the ancient and the medieval, and two, the divide between the medieval and the Renaissance.
Right.
And I think that one of the things that really struck me in working on and I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to get into more of the medieval reception of Dares, but one of the things that really struck me was that particularly these medieval poets managed to articulate this very robust sort of rhetoric of history and the importance of the truth of history. And they use a medium, i.e., medieval Latin epic, that they know that they have to say is in some way mendacious or dangerous, or especially to Christian readers can seem very problematic. And they sort of use that to articulate a defense of history. And it strikes me that, and one of the things that I think really surprised me a lot in working on this book was the ways in which that discourse kind of just as operable in the Renaissance, but it becomes the language that the critics are using to indict Dares, even though the sort of rhetoric of the sort of the need for historical veracity is something that gets articulated so robustly by some of these 12th and 13th century poets. And so I think in some, I want to sort of see the project on Dares as a way of arguing for a much longer kind of longue durée continuity between what we now call the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And the other thing I would add is that I think it also really foregrounds what has really transformed the study of classics in the past half century, which is sort of the invention of the concept of late antiquity as a way of kind of softening the sharp dichotomy between the ancient and the medieval. And I was thinking about this actually in your earlier question. I think one of the things that's really interesting to sort of imagine is, if indeed whoever wrote Dares in Latin, was in the 5th or the 6th century, maybe a contemporary of somebody like Boethius or Cassiodorus, living in this world in which there is already that sense of pathos for a kind of combination of loss and change and transformation, yet continuity with this earlier Greco-Roman world. So that if this author sort of invokes someone like Nepos and Sallust, they're looking across sort of almost half a millennium. And so I think that one of the things I also hope that this does is show the ways in which patterns of receiving the past that are established in late antiquity kind of reverberate across what we now call the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and even beyond into the 18th century.
Yeah, I think that is what you're after here, and what ultimately the stakes of both these projects together really are, and so I'm looking forward to that, because I'm myself thinking a lot about periodization these days. So it's useful for me to hear you speculate on this, on that connection. The next question is really about why Dares sort of seems to stand apart from others in the period, and I'll read the question. It goes like this: Dictus and Dares are often mentioned in the same breath, and their works are published together in the Renaissance and later, but Dares seems to have been much more important in the earlier Middle Ages. Can you comment on the reasons you see for the foregrounding of Dares in the period? Is it only because the Latin is easier, or do you think there are other reasons?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Yeah, and so basically, as the questioner rightly says, is the Dares and Dictus really sort of, in a sense, switch places over the course of from the Middle Ages to the 17th century. So by the time we get to the 17th century, so actually someone like Vossius, he actually says a little bit later on, he says, well, actually, he says Dictus is actually much more learned, and he says, oh well, Dictus is also fake, but at least the Latin is much better, and it's a good read, and it's actually erudite, whereas he says, oh, Dares is just kind of trash, and we can forget about Dares. But one of the reasons why so we have these humanists who actually, if they have to choose between Dares and Dictus, increasingly end up choosing Dictus. In the middle, at least in the sort of Western Latin Middle Ages, one of the reasons I think why Dares enjoys such a wider dissemination, particularly than Dictus, is because of this Greek versus Trojan dichotomy. So you get this really, I think Dares becomes so important because of these claims of Trojan origins. And I sort of briefly mentioned Geoffrey of Monmouth, who is a 12th century British author who he gives us all these wonderful details about King Arthur, but he also has this story of the Trojan Brutus founding Britain. And that association between Geoffrey and Dares is the single most common one in manuscripts. So it's quite remarkable. Of the about 200 extant manuscripts of Dares, I think it's 28 of them also have Geoffrey. And in many cases, Dares is sort of directly used as a prologue. So you can see these scribes and compilers attempting to establish these kind of continuous histories using multiple texts. And so I think that Dares plays a very key role in articulating this kind of Trojan identity. And I guess if one claims Trojan identity, that also gives rise to anti-Greek invective, which does become very common in the Middle Ages as well. So there are, for instance, these longstanding tropes of the mendacity of the Greeks that oftentimes get repeated in these medieval sources. And even a sense, there's actually I'm forgetting which one it is, but one of the crusading accounts after I think it's after the Latins take Constantinople in 1204. One of them says, "Oh, this is our revenge as Trojans for what you Greeks did to us." So there's, I think, a very complicated sort of geopolitics also going on behind the relative preference for a quote unquote Trojan source over a Greek source. And then by the time we get to the humanists in the early modern period, they're able to read Greek. They're now doing a lot of important Greek scholarship, and they come to see Dictus actually in much better light than Dares. So that's a good question.
Okay, thanks. Here's a question from the audience that, in fact, I was going to ask you. Can you say something about the claim that Dares wrote on leaves of palm? Was this aspect a part of the discourse about him and his legacy?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And I was only able to find, what's really interesting about that is that it only appears, as far as I know, in Isadore. So it's not, the prefatory letter from Nepos to Sallust is very, very brief, and perhaps purposefully so. It doesn't give us any details about the sort of physicality of the manuscript that Nepos supposedly finds. Isadore has this nice detail, right, about these leaves of palm, which then gets picked up over and over again, basically by encyclopedists, both through the Middle Ages and then into the early modern period, who start to just kind of verbatim kind of repeat Isadore. Dictus, in contrast, I think it's the preface claims, I think that it's written on I think it's linden tablets or something. So there's also this sense of wanting to talk about kind of the physicality or the materiality.
Yeah.
And so that's a really, yeah, it's a really interesting question. It was a rabbit hole that I went down trying to find, for instance, where exactly Isidore had gotten this. And because Isidore pretty much just copied everything wholesale from earlier sources. One of the other medieval commentators, 12th century, like actually changes this slightly. This formulation, I talk about it a bit in the book, and uses this formulation that I really like, that Dares wrote with the stylus of truth. And so you almost get this sense of that there is something about the very materiality and physicality of
Yes.
writing that imbue the text with authenticity and authority. Yeah, the same thing. Geoffrey of Monmouth has, he talks about the book that he, he says, oh, I got this, it was a very ancient book and I just translated into Latin. Like, so all of these texts have these finding narratives, and they are in some sense purposely vague, oh, the book disappeared, I don't have it anymore, but yeah, so I think that's very interesting. Like, it is so interesting to me that Isidore and everyone who follows in his wake repeats this detail about palm leaves.
Now, and a related question, sort of related, but also about the materiality of the transmission of this text. What about scribes? You mentioned this in passing, but what is the role of scribes in maintaining a forgery, in altering it, in perhaps sometimes adding things that move it back toward veracity or something? I mean, is there a role? Is there a something to talk about here in how scribes fit into this argument?
Yeah. Oh, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, there is I think so much intervention that is happening in these really,
there must be, yeah,
really just bizarre, kind of wonderful but bizarre ways. And that is really the story of the. So in the, I think it's chapter 2 of the book, I sort of start with some of these very strange manuscript contexts that sort of lay the groundwork for this reception. One of them, which I didn't get a chance to talk about here, is that one of the earliest versions is this Frankish version. Mm-hmm. So not the manuscript I showed, but the one that I sort of briefly alluded to in the so-called Chronicle of Frederick. And what's remarkable about surviving manuscripts of what this scribe or compiler does is they insert Dares into the chronicle, and it actually in manuscripts bears the remarkably strange and anachronistic title, Dares the Phrygian on the Origins of the Franks. And so somehow the story of it, basically what it does is in this version, it condenses the story of the actual war into, Dares is already a fairly short text. It's about, in the 19th century edition, it's about 50 pages long. This text, in the MGH edition, this Frankish text is about 5 pages long. So it gives this highly abbreviated account of the war. But what's so interesting is it sometimes inserts dialogue that is actually just straight echoes of the Vulgate translation of the Bible. So it's this really interesting melding of sort of the Christian and the pagan. And then the scribe uses this says, okay, well, that's the war. Now Aeneas goes to Rome, but let me tell you about these Trojan Franks who founded Arcady. And this is entirely built upon the skeleton of Jerome's World Chronicle. So this is integrated into a universal history. And Troy, in a sense, becomes a kind of, a stop on the train, as it were. So we see so many, there are so many really interesting examples of scribes sort of, I guess I would say, enhancing the text. Another example, the manuscript from William of Malmesbury that I showed,
right?
He adds at the end of that a Trojan genealogy that is just titled "On the Origins of the Trojans," and we don't know exactly where he found this. Now, he knew that Cato the Elder had written a largely lost work that survives in some fragments called On Origins, about the origins of the Romans. So in this manuscript, he posits that this is a fragment from Cato. And so he ends Dares, and then he writes, oh, and here's Cato on Trojan origins. And so one of the things I look at in the book is tracing how that little genealogy, it's about 10 lines long, then gets picked up. Subsequent scribes start to incorporate it into the text. The attribution to Cato disappears. And in some early modern printings of the text, it actually says, oh, and this is Dares on the origins of the Trojans.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this kind of, the text manages to engulf all these little additions. And I think one of the things that's most remarkable is then to trace how, decisions that a compiler makes in the 12th century, reverberate in, the 16th century and the 17th century in the history of early print, in the history of print.
Yeah, yeah. May I ask a question about canons? I mean, one of the things that people in the modern world are understandably very concerned about is how literary and historical canons are made, what gets admitted to canons and how. And so I guess what I want to ask is, how does what does the longevity and the popularity of Dares that in the time of its popularity directly challenged two of the most canonical of classical authors, Homer and Virgil, and it enjoyed great success in doing so for a long time. What does that period of longevity and popularity tell us about the contingency of canons, how canons are made, the problems of canonicity? And is there anything here that is a lesson for us as we think about canons more recently in the modern world?
Yeah, I think that's something that I always try to actually use this example of Dares to actually talk to students about precisely this problem. Yeah. And that, as you say, right, that the very first thing that it highlights is just the incredible contingency of canonicity. And I think one of the things that's, I think, most instructive is to sort of, tell a student today, like, imagine you were in a 12th century schoolroom.
Right.
And you can go back and you can look at the lists of because in some sense, in its most basic form, canons are these sort of just lists of school authors. And, you would be, you'd be reading Dares, Homer would be sort of but a name. You might read, there was a Latin sort of epitome of Homer's Iliad called the Ilias Latina. So you might read that. And one of the, I think, things that's really instructive then is to compare Dares with hundreds of manuscripts throughout the Middle Ages, and then to think about some of these other texts that in the 20th century or 21st we might refer to as canonical in classics, say someone like Tacitus or Catullus, Lucretius, as there's been a lot of work recently on sort of the early modern recovery of Lucretius. All these things that survive in just a handful of manuscripts. The thread is so thin with some of these texts that then ended up, for various reasons in the early modern period, becoming popular and hence canonical. And Dares experiences sort of the opposite fortunes of, basically being read until, the 18th century, and then, only being read by, 4 people or something. And so I think that, right, there's this sense that it allows us to see contingency. And I think the other thing actually that it does is it shows, I think we oftentimes have a tendency to imagine something like, or kind of discourse about the canon oftentimes imagines this kind of monolithic block of sort of like received texts. And there's a way in which Dares, it is actually a highly subversive, highly, it's a text that if you believe it's true, then you believe that, that Virgil was complicit in basically covering up a narrative that Rome's founder was a traitor. And, that it's I think remarkable to see, and this even goes back all the way to Servius and other ancient commentators discuss this problem of, that there's this counter tradition that has always been out there of Aeneas as this traitor. And I think one of the things that I want to try to do is to show the sort of political and ideological stakes of that, and to show how sort of within what we now think of as a canon are actually debates that are challenging the very heart of those texts that we would take as canonical. And I think same thing with Homer, where you see that, Dares is, whether the original author intended this literally or parodically or whatever, that it is a challenge to sort of the very premise of that kind of poetic enterprise. So the perennial nature of conflict, perhaps, as opposed to a fixed
as opposed to a fixed thing. Yeah. We're heading into our last 5 or 6 minutes here, and I want to ask you a question on behalf of those members of the audience who are probably, some of them are either classicists as students, or perhaps even undergraduates who aspire to work in the field of classics. You mentioned in your field in classics, the relatively recent invention of the category of late antiquity. And, I wonder if you could, for the benefit of everyone really, could you situate the kind of work you do in terms of where it fits in classics today, and help people to understand how somebody who works on such a broad span of time as you do is a classicist?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, so I think I'm hoping that my work can sort of maybe do two things. One, as you say, right, to kind of to participate in the sort of both the temporal and geographic sort of widening of what the field of classics allows. And I think that, it's interesting when we think about, so late antiquity as a concept is in sort of temporal divisions of it change, depending on the interpreter, but sometimes it's in its widest sense, can sometimes be anything from, say, the 2nd or 3rd century CE all the way up to, the 8th century. And it is a category which I think in many ways seeks to revise a model, and this actually is something that I'm sort of wrestling with in my other project on periodization. It sort of seeks to maybe challenge or complicate the paradigm sort of articulated by Edward Gibbon of sort of the decline and fall of Rome, and this idea that we can sort of identify a sort of radical break at the so-called end of the ancient world. And so I think we've seen, at least within the discipline, a widening of the temporal expanse of what the field allows. For instance, maybe more and more seminars on late antique literature. So for instance, sort of late antique poetry has become a really active field recently. And even a text like Dares, I think, is really profitable just to be studied as an example of late antique literature, even though we can't exactly pin down its composition. And the other sort of move that I'm sort of participating in is what classicists sort of refer to as classical reception. So this sort of the study of the ways in which material from Greco-Roman antiquity gets kind of reused or refracted or picked up in later contexts. And some of those contexts can be, some of those contexts can be the Middle Ages and early modern Europe. Some of them can be contemporary film. I have a colleague at USC who does fascinating work looking at sort of Arabic translations of Greek materials in medieval Antioch, and looking at, for instance, ways that Greek conceptions of matter are read in the Arabic commentary tradition. And so I think that reception also allows for a widening not just temporally, but also geographically and culturally of the reach of sort of, and I think one of the things that it does, and some of the things I tried to accomplish in this book, is to show that there's always that negotiation that happens is not just a sort of a model of a later context sort of passively receiving a text or an idea or context, but rather that there's this constant give and take, and that produces something that it kind of in this like dialectical fashion produces this third thing that cannot be reduced to either the ancient or the modern. And it's a really, I mean, I think we see this. There's really fascinating work being done on, on the sort of Latin writing, Latin culture in the Americas in the 16th and 17th century. And, so I think that there's so many new fields. And one of the things I always tell students is that one of the perhaps almost practical advantages of this is that working in these later contexts and science can give you a chance to work on a text or a scholar or a figure who really has not been worked on before. And so one of the things
as opposed to the stereotype of classics as a closed canon that where everything has been said, right? Exactly.
That it allows you, maybe the text you'll end up working on, maybe there is no modern edition, or maybe there, maybe then there's probably no English, there are no translations. It really gives you the chance to kind of be the first person to really engage with that work. And one of the things that I've found, and partially I think this has been, a sort of practical exigency that has been forced upon all of us working this last year during the pandemic. One of the things that's been a lifesaver to me is just how I can now find any 16th or 17th century Latin text that I need in a digital format. And I can sit at home and engage with these texts that, previously might have required, of course, there's no substitute, of course, for sitting with that book in, in its, as we talked about, physical material. But that there is a vast ocean of material, I think, waiting for students and for future generations of scholars to pick up upon.
Well, that's a good note for us to stop on. And glancing at the comments, I know that our audience wants me to convey to you their warm thanks for that incredibly rich presentation and for this lively Q&A. It has been a wonderful event, and thank you so much for joining us, Fred. To the audience then, everyone who registered for today's event, this is what we do in this series, everyone was automatically entered into a drawing to receive one of 3 signed copies of Frederic Clark's book, The First Pagan Historian. And so let me announce the 3 winners of the signed copies of the book. They are Karen Bailey, Claudia Brooks, and David Stiver. And we will be in touch by email with each of you about getting the book to you. And as we conclude here, I want to say thank you again to so many of you who have joined us virtually over the past year. Your participation in the intellectual life of the Stanford Humanities Center means a great deal to us. We hope to be able to welcome you to the center in person in the coming year, while still serving our remote audience with a hybrid format. Our current plans are to kick off a new era in the fall when we hold our next presidential lecture in the humanities for an online audience, and then make the transition to the mixed format in which we hold events in person, and they are also available to the same worldwide audience that we're addressing today. So please stay tuned for more on that. And in the meantime, you can always check our website, shc.stanford.edu, for the latest updates. We're going to have a quiet summer, and we will hope to see you back here in a couple of months. Thank you.